early on, it didn't make sense to have just this defined sandbox that you can go do things and test equipment at. That if you really wanted to see the potential of this system, you had to go where the use cases needed them, meaning you had to go to these industry areas that people would actually operate the unmanned airplane.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 368. What's new at the Northern Plains UAS test site? For that question, we head to Grand Forks, North Dakota, and speak with Trevor Woods, Executive Director of the Northern Plains UAS test site. The Northern Plains UAS test site was founded by the North Dakota Department of Commerce in 2013 as one of the 7 FAA-designated UAS test sites. Its mission is to collaborate with FAA and industry partners to develop equipment, systems, rules, and procedures to safely integrate unmanned aircraft into the national airspace system without negatively impacting existing general or commercial aviation. In January 2022, Trevor Woods was selected as the executive director of the test site. He started his career in aviation at the University of North Dakota with a Bachelor of Business Administration in Aviation Management. But he's been flying since he was a teenager, spending his high school years working on obtaining a private pilot's license. He went on to earn a Master's of Business Administration degree while working at the University of North Dakota, doing flight training, which merged into UAS testing, research, waiver, and regulatory submissions to the FAA. Trevor has been with the Northern Plains UAS test site since the beginning. Before becoming the executive director, he was director of safety, working extensively with the FAA. He was instrumental in North Dakota being selected as one of the 10 participants in the UAS Integration Pilot Program, now the Beyond program. He participates in the FAA's Unmanned Aircraft Safety Team and served as the lead on the FAA's BVLOS ARC Working Group 2.1. Trevor also played a pivotal role in the inception of Vantis, North Dakota's Beyond Visual Line of Sight initiative. He was the natural choice to take over as executive director and lead the test site into the next stage of making the impossible possible. In this episode of the Drone Radio Show, Trevor talks about the Northern Plains UAS test site and gives us an update on Vantis and other initiatives where they're leading in UAS operations and integration. But before we hear from Trevor, I want to recognize Bill Black from Australia as the newest member of the Drone Radio Show Advocates. As I mentioned last week, I've created a space where we can talk about the podcast and all things related to the drone industry. As a Drone Radio Show advocate, you'll be able to talk about current shows, bounce around ideas for episodes, suggest questions of upcoming guests, get some behind-the-scenes insights, and pick up some DRS swag and gain access to exclusive content. To become a Drone Radio Show advocate, go to patreon.com/Drone Radio Show. And by the way, if you have a great story on the use of drones that you'd like to share in a podcast, contact me at randy@droneradioshow.com. So let's get an update on what's happening at the Northern Plains UAS test site with Trevor Woods. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Trevor to introduce himself.
Trevor Woods, the Executive Director of the Northern Plains UAS test site.
Thanks, Trevor. Tell us about the Northern Plains UAS test site.
Northern Plains UAS test site is one of 7 designated test sites in the country. We were originally established at the end of 2013 and so became operational pretty much right out of the gate in 2014 and have been around since. The intention of the test sites was to, work with industry and work with the FAA to help facilitate integration of unmanned systems into the national airspace system.
Being 8 years old, would you consider the center to be more of a mature test site?
Yes, that's definitely correct. There's always room for continued maturity and growth, no doubt, but we've definitely come a long way since the very beginning. At the very beginning, there wasn't even Part 107, hasn't even existed yet at that point. And now we're seeing not only 107, but an update to 107 with night operations and flight over people, very robust waiver processes that we're seeing being issued. And we're at the cusp of seeing the birth of some new regulations that will ideally help enable beyond visual line of sight, given the work of the Beyond Visual Line of Sight Aviation Rulemaking Committee. So in the context of aviation and the FAA and how this has all come together, I think that's actually pretty incredible what we've been able to achieve in 8 years. But as we look to the future and look at the next, we're coming up on the 10-year mark real quick. And so then you look ahead another 10 years, what else can we be doing? And when you start to consider the maturity of the systems that are coming out and the ask of these systems like advanced air mobility and delivery, I think there's still a lot of work to do on the regulatory front, and more specifically just in the government domain as how government can support industry to continue to mature and grow in a safe way, of course, without negatively impacting the existing system that we love today that allows us to just go board a plane and go fly somewhere across the world. So there's definitely some room for continued maturity and growth, but I think we've done quite a bit in those 8 years.
How would you characterize the culture of the Northern Plains UAS test site? I mean, what makes it different than the other test sites?
I kind of look to North Dakota values in our culture that help describe, what sets us apart and is unique for the Northern Plains UAS test site. I think we have this get it done kind of operationalizing mindset. And what I mean by that is, we know that the technology isn't perfect and it's going to continue to grow and evolve and new technology is going to come out. But regardless of that, what can we do today with what we have available to us today that will bring value, whether it be bring value to an end user or to a client that we support like the FAA or other governmental entities, or even the citizens of North Dakota who live here. Whatever we do, how is that creating value? And can we define that? Is just flying the airplane good enough, or is flying the airplane for a purpose that is actually accomplishing something more important? And I think that's what it is. And so I think that kind of sets us apart. And I say that not trying to provide an opinion on the other test sites and what make them unique, but I think that's something we like to focus on is how is this actually going to create value at some point down the line? And maybe to bring it into a little bit more of a practical mindset, how is this going to be useful for somebody or for some industry at some point in the future? And if you can't really answer that, it's a little bit harder for us to want to, help support. That doesn't mean we won't, but I would say that's one of our unique attributes that we bring to the table.
A couple of years ago, I did an interview with Nick Flom, the former director of the test site. He spoke about the Vantis program and its role in managing unmanned air traffic. At that time, the project was just about to start. So could you update us on Vantis today?
Yes, definitely. Vantis has come a long way since the last you heard about it. 2021 was spent really working to deploy what we call a key site. And at that point, the state's making a significant investment in this. And so we wanted to make sure we were making the absolute best choice we could. So we went on a procurement to identify system integrators. These are the folks that would bring forth the required technology suite that helped to enable beyond visual line of sight. And so let me define that a little bit here. To keep it really simple, to enable beyond visual line of sight, you need to solve an ability to see other airplanes flying in the airspace system. So you can do that with like a radar. You need the ability to control your own airplane flying through the airspace system, so a command and control type radio. You need to have a network that can connect those two devices or those two systems together, because I have to be able to, as a pilot, see other traffic and then be able to maneuver my airplane to remain clear. And the network is what brings those together to let you do that. And then one of the more important parts is the ability to monitor the health of that system at all times. Much like the check engine light in a car, is constantly monitoring performance of the engine and all the systems that allow it to run. And if something is wrong or something's not quite right, it throws the check engine light. Well, the same thing happens here. Is we have what's called a Mission and Network Operations Center that is monitoring the health of the network and the surveillance system and the communication system to make sure everything's working as expected and as it should, which is really critical for safety of flight type aspects. And then the absolute last part that you need to have, of course, is an airplane that can actually do this. Since if you don't have the airplane, it's really not useful. And so we went on a procurement and partnered with a couple system integrators who could bring forth that technology. And we asked them to deploy a key site out in Western North Dakota. And the key site is, hey, deploy kind of a smaller, geographically bound version of this system. Let's test and validate that system in fact works as we think it does. And then let's go get FAA approval of that system. So we did that. And we tested the system. They checked out really well. We flew manned airplanes against it, unmanned airplanes against it to really make sure everything worked, and really started to assess how this system can be applied to like use cases and industry users and public good. And by the end of 2021, we down selected to Thales, who is now the prime system integrator for the state of North Dakota for the next 8 years to help bring forth Vantis. And so as we now are in midway through 2022, we are continuing to build the maturity on that system and start to focus on scaling and expanding the system to other parts of the state of North Dakota. Much like the cellular network, right? Where, your cell phone was only valuable when it was in the service region of a tower. That's kind of the same thing with Vantis. You've got to have these areas that have that coverage of surveillance and control and be able to tie that together at the network. And so that's what we're focusing now for 2022 is to scale up that key site to other parts of North Dakota and really start to focus on using the technology for industry purposes or for specific use cases.
Do operators have to actually be within the corridor, or can they operate their drones off-site from anywhere in the world?
Today, we are having them operate from within the service volume. And that's really just for safety mitigation reasons, because it is still very early in the design and the deployment of the network that, you need to build maturity and confidence in the system. And so that's an easy one to just have the operators remain within. But remaining within doesn't mean that they remain within visual line of sight. It's a big enough area that they could absolutely fly beyond visual line of sight once the system is being used as the primary means of mitigation. As the system matures, definitely we'll have the capability of operating where the pilot in command, so to speak, it does not have to be located within the service volume that the Vantis network offers. And that's where the real value add will be. That's like any type of maturity of technology, right? What you can do with it today and what you would like to do with it, it's just a curve that you have to get through and build and mature before you can realize that vision.
And down the road, what we all recognize is that there's a huge value proposition when unmanned systems are allowed to work without people being there to watch them.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I like to use analogies a lot because I just think it helps to simplify. And I think like where we're at today in the world of drones is it's a lot like driving on roads that maybe have just been developed. We've just figured out how to pave with asphalt or concrete, so the roads are still a little immature. The cars and vehicles themselves are still relatively new and the reliability isn't quite so high. And maybe we have a maximum speed limit of 30 miles per hour. Well, when you get a waiver from the FAA, it's kind of like the equivalent of I got temporary approval to drive 70 miles per hour on this 30 mile per hour stretch of road. It's really not ideal. Yes, you can do it. Yes, you can prove a safety case that, hey, I'm limiting traffic on the road, or I'm, putting signs up to let people know I'm going to be driving fast. Again, this is all just an analogy, but that's kind of where we're at today. And what we're doing with Vantis is much like, let me build the interstate that lets me drive 70 in the first place. It's not just a normal 2-lane road, but we've got to have higher quality concrete or asphalt. They've got to be more than 1 lane in each direction. You've got to have medians. You've got to have certain types of, shoulders. That's really what Vantis is about, is to actually create that interstate that lets you drive 70 in the first place, as opposed to trying to get a waiver every single time. And because of that, of course, it just takes longer to kind of develop that system and to mature that system. But once it's there, it opens up the gate to a lot more capability that you otherwise didn't have before. It's build the interstate because not only does it let me drive 70 miles per hour, but it also allows the 18-wheeler to traverse along the roadway. That enables commerce activity to occur much more efficiently. It's that kind of capability that we expect to see out of Vantis down the line as well. But you've really got to work on just building that foundation first.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the boundary for the test site the entire state of North Dakota?
I would say bigger. When we started the test site, the response to the FAA proposal was, define an area that can be your quote unquote test range. I always felt that was very short-sighted when that came out, and not to the FAA's fault or anything. That was just the way you think about things. And myself personally, I was around when we wrote that proposal. I actually helped to write the proposal for the state amongst other key individuals that are still around as well. And we decided strategically that early on, it didn't make sense to have just this defined sandbox that you can go do things and test equipment at. That if you really wanted to see the potential of this system, you had to go where the use cases needed them. Meaning you had to go to these industry areas that people would actually operate the unmanned airplane. And so though we responded with some specific areas we could do testing, we really designed our processes and procedures to be remote and mobile in mind right from the onset of this program. And so in our response, we said, the whole state of North Dakota, but realistically, what you do in North Dakota can remain true in nearly the rest of the United States, with some exceptions, of course, like flying in New York City would be entirely different than flying in middle of nowhere, North Dakota or Wyoming or something like that. But for the most part, what you do in North Dakota can be very much translated to many other parts of the United States. And so it is of my view that the test site is really wherever the use case brings us as the technology allows us to operate. That's a little bit of a sliding scale depending on, the date and time that you're trying to do the test, but it really opens the door for trying to realize the value of these systems earlier than you would with just a defined geographical bounded area.
The system integrator is a company called Thales. Why were they chosen, and what do they offer?
They are a France-based worldwide company. One of the contributing factors on why they were selected is that they already run like 60 to 70% of the world air traffic management systems. So the infrastructure that actually allows air traffic management to work across the world, in majority being run and operated by Thales. And so they have a lot of experience in this space already. And they have, a really visionary thought in terms of how to leverage those existing systems and apply them to unmanned systems. And so we really liked that approach. It really made a lot of sense for North Dakota. And so we're really excited to have them as a partner. And, I think together we can do some really amazing things with Beyond Visual Line of Sight.
As part of the plan, there's a mission and operations center for Vantis. What will go on at that center?
If you recall, I talked about the analogy of having like your check engine light. That's what this Mission and Network Operations Center is for Vantis. It's really monitoring the performance and the technology that makes up Vantis to let you know that everything's working great, or if not, that something is not in line and needs to be reevaluated. So that's a physical location that is located at the Grand Sky Aviation and Business Park, which is out at the Grand Forks Air Force Base. And so, yeah, that is a operations center. Think if you ever watched a movie with like NASA, in it, where they're launching, a rocket or a space shuttle, and you got this big room with different stations. It's a lot like that, but much smaller, where, you've got these workstations that are monitoring the health of the system and in communication with the people who are operating on it, which today is really the testing and validation in the use case development flights that are going on.
Is the center intended to be a long-term part of Vantis, or is it just being used for the development phase?
It is expected to be one of the permanent fixtures of Vantis looking ahead. It was constructed, as a physical building, and it was built appropriately with scalability and repeatability in mind. So as the system comes online, think of the MNOC as that nerve center. That's where all the nerves route back to that spot. And it doesn't even have like exclusivity of North Dakota, as these systems could move past the boundaries of North Dakota. Folks may be able to deploy infrastructure and connect it into this MNOC so that it can have, the right safety monitoring and integrity of it that allows BVLOS. So it was really developed with that vision in mind, that, it's not just built for like a test system, but it is built for longevity.
There are many different types of unmanned vehicles made by several different manufacturers. How do you ensure Vantis will work for everyone?
So one of the things we identified in 2021 was the need to have additional types of airplanes that could be onboarded onto this network. Think of it like this. I'll go back to an analogy of the roads. We're kind of doing the equivalent of building new roads in a world where these type of roads have never existed before, or they were very limited in capability. And so you put yourself in that mindset of, I'm building a road that's never been built before. I might have some sort of special asphalt or concrete mix that I'm testing, and I'm doing this in a limited way because you don't want to spend a ton of money if it's not going to work. But you got to build out enough of this infrastructure. But the road doesn't do anything without the vehicle. And so the multi-UAS RFP is that equivalent, where we went to industry and said, for those of you that are interested in doing routine beyond visual line of sight and that are aligned with this type of concept of using terrestrial infrastructure to do that, let's see what your airplane can do, and let's see what the kind of use cases you're looking to enable. That was a different initiative to solicit help from industry to bring forth airplanes and drone systems that could operate on this network. Then we can start to integrate them and fly them against their intended use cases.
Following a wave of severe blizzard conditions in April, the state of North Dakota enlisted UAS Technologies to help restore services to residents and assist in recovery efforts. Can you describe the role of the Northern Plains UAS test site in this effort?
North Dakota has been hit with some unusually late seasonal blizzards in April and May. We get blizzards, but these were pretty robust in nature, meaning a couple feet of snow as well as ice and some very, very, very incredibly strong winds. Travel was basically impossible. And they kind of hit back to back. And so what happened is one of these late blizzards hit the western part of North Dakota. And I don't know all the details, but I understand that ice fell. It fell as liquid precipitation. It eventually froze. The wind picked up. And when you get ice surrounding some of this wooden infrastructure that is the backbone of our electrical distribution systems, it causes the wood to fail and snaps. And when that happens, the power line goes down and knocks electricity out for several customers who rely on that. Okay, so that's not highly unusual, but what was unusual was the impact that this particular storm had late in April. I don't know the numbers right now off the top of my head because I understand they're still trying to aggregate that kind of information, but there was a significant portion of western North Dakota that was offline potentially for weeks because the amount of infrastructure that was impacted was unprecedented. And so the electrical utility operators in the area have literally asked for help from other outside utility companies to bring, the equipment needed to help bring the poles back up and bring the system back online. Well, when that all happened, the lieutenant governor, who sits on the chair of our authority board, who oversees all of this, called up and asked if there was an opportunity to use drones and our investment in Vantis to help with recovery efforts from the storm. And of course, I'm always up for a challenge. And the fact that I happened to be in Orlando at AUVSI meant that I happened to be in close proximity to the Federal Aviation Administration, the regulating agency that approves these things. And we were able to obtain an approval, leveraging all of the history and the work that we've done up to this point, to get a limited ability to fly beyond visual line of sight with small unmanned aircraft to assist in the recovery efforts that were needed out in the western side of North Dakota. And so that all just happened to coincide with the fact that we were at AUVSI at the time. And it worked out really well that the utility operator who was able to be supported found a lot of value in the information. It allowed them to be able to see infrastructure that they still at that time couldn't get access to because of the amount of snow that fell. It allowed their engineers to make better decisions instead of wasting their time trying to drive across, encumbered roads. So it was a really valuable effort that I think saw, what drones could really do as a potential for something like, emergency response.
Were you able to structure the program so that it could be easily replicated in the future if needed?
The big value here was, and we didn't do this alone, by the way, one of our local companies, iSight RPV Services, was part of this process. And that's probably what made this the most value. And I'm saying that because it eventually goes back to answering your question. iSight, they exist to operate unmanned airplanes. They go out there and they do lots of inspection and work all across the world already. And so when we were called upon to help support this recovery effort, my biggest piece of it was that I was able to help assist in obtaining just some additional privileges with the FAA. But the value was that those privileges, because we are already partnered with iSight and other companies, they were able to leverage those approvals that they otherwise were not able to do on their own. Now, your question, was this built so that it could be replicated? Well, in the heat of the moment, we really weren't thinking about it like that because, of course, when you get the call, can you support an emergency? You don't really dig into it too much more than that. You just say yes and you go. But looking back at it, I do think that we were able to demonstrate a lot of positives and demonstrate that our safety systems work. And that I do think it opened the opportunity for us to be able to have a repeatable response again. And so that conversation has started. It's not just the FAA approval, but it's also, any sort of state's ability in their emergency management processes to understand how drones could fit in to those processes and to prepare for the usage of those drones in those particular playbooks or use cases that you might be interested in. So that's the conversation that started. The FAA part of it comes a little bit later once you have an understanding how you're going to execute on it in the first place.
Trevor, can you give us a sense of the current state of regulations pertaining to drone use?
There's probably two components to that question. I think the intention of saying, legislative is really the regulatory front, and that's the Beyond Visual Line of Sight Aviation Rulemaking Committee, or what you commonly hear is the ARC. I inherited a leadership role on the ARC because Nick was on that role when he departed the organization. And so myself and Aaron Raisler on the team helped support that to its completion, which was only like a couple months ago. And so the Aviation Rulemaking Committee, what the purpose of it is to provide recommendations to the FAA on how to shape the rulemaking process that would ultimately become the basis for Beyond Visual Line of Sight UAS operations. So that was an incredible experience. And it was also a lot of work for the industry folks who were part of it. And it was very well represented industry involvement. There was nearly 100 participants that held various roles for this. And in my mind, it's critical because it's not just the FAA coming out with what they think the rules should be or the regulations should be, because you're never going to win on that kind of proposal. But in this case, it's industry that is bringing forth recommendations, and this is work sanctioned by the FAA to do that. Now, so the recommendations came out, and there's some areas that I think are going to be easier for the FAA to start to implement compared to other parts of the rule, and that's okay. What they can do is they can start to put an NPRM together that goes out to the public, that solicits public feedback, that ultimately leads to the rule. And you can do that in kind of a phased approach where, you can put your quote unquote, the easiest part of the recommendations in play sooner than later and let the more complex things work out and build upon the new rules when they do come out. And so that's what I'd call like the more of the regulatory side of things. The legislative side of things has to do, of course, with the legislator and the government. And at the state level, the state of North Dakota is going to be going through an election cycle here. There's going to be a lot of new faces, I think, in the legislator. But I'm really excited to, kind of present and talk about what work we're doing. And I think they're excited to see, what kind of legacy in the future are we leaving in North Dakota in terms of leading the way for this industry to build opportunity. And so I think they're pretty excited. And then, of course, there's the federal side of the legislator, which is, why does the FAA UAS test site program exist in the first place? First place is because of federal legislation. And our expiration is actually coming up in 2023. And so cautiously optimistic, we're going to see an extension of the test site program in the next FAA reauthorization, whenever that happens to come out.
What's planned for the Northern Plains test site in the coming months?
Besides continuing along with Vantis, we're really excited to continue to push forth on, various projects that we have. We have some federal funded contract opportunities that are, constantly the domain of integration and detection work, because all the good that UAS can do, there's also a lot of nefarious activities. And so we help support some of those efforts. We have numerous private industry type folks that we work with, whether it be in just providing our opinion on how to move ahead to helping facilitate testing and research flights for them. We've been doing work with the Broad Agency Announcement Program that the FAA uses to fund some of these initiatives. And of course, we're always looking at proposal opportunities and other things that are coming down the line. The problem is like the real fun stuff, we're not allowed to talk about, even though I would love to, but it really aligns well with advanced air mobility type work that's going on out there. And so that makes me pretty excited to see what could be, in the next decade or so for this industry.
And how about yourself? Taking over the reins as the executive director, what key goals are you hoping to achieve moving forward?
I've been part of the test site program since the very beginning. And I worked really closely with my predecessor. When we were first established and, Bob Beckland was our executive director then, it was really just about doing something, we got set up with pretty low expectations, in my opinion, not by Bob, but just nobody really knew what this program could be. And so at that point, it's just kind of like about survival and just doing something. And then when Nick took over, we really worked on growing our technical expertise. We had very, very highly technical people that grew and developed in this program, and they're very good assets. And, you kind of mentioned it early on, about maturing and no longer a startup. And that's kind of the phase I see us in, is like, we've got to start thinking longer term here. We got to start thinking more strategically in terms of how we make decisions and how we support operations moving ahead. And so, my mark, if I were to say, as a goal here, is to help have a little bit more of a defined strategy, thinking ahead to about the next decade and beyond. And I think as we go into the legislative session, our next legislative session is going to be kicking off in January of 2023. It was also kind of necessary to start to put this message together, to understand what is UAS and drones doing and what is automation systems doing for the people of North Dakota and why this is valuable to continue to remain here. So that's really my goal, is probably to have a little bit better idea on just what the future could look like to make sure that we are heading in the right direction for it. And like you said, we're kind of transitioning from this isn't a startup anymore. This is continuing to grow. So we've got to think that way as an organization moving ahead.
Before I close, just a reminder to the Drone Radio Show advocates. Check out the Patreon page for a little additional content from my conversation with Trevor. Now for my final question, Trevor. What message would you like to leave regarding the future of the drone industry?
I've given this some thought recently because we've been talking a lot about strategy and vision. And I think everyone's really excited about the potential of drones. And there's also a lot of frustration in, this isn't coming fast enough. But drones and autonomous systems for myself, I think could be truly transformational for the world. And I say that because a lot of times it gets wrapped up in some of the negativity of like taking jobs away. But what it does is it allows us to focus on what's more important. It's about getting our time back. It's about having a better quality of life because these kinds of systems can do the boring, monotonous tasks. And it also increases safety of the people involved by using these types of systems. And so I like to look at what was like the, personal computer and internet like for the early generations and the early adopters, and they weren't very accessible to all. And at some point in time, many people have heard the vision of, you're going to have a personal computer in everyone's home. You're probably like, wow, that sounds like an incredible future. But they didn't really think about what that meant, and nor could you even perceive what that meant. And then eventually you get your first computer and you're like, really amazed, like, wow, this is really cool. And what you ended up doing is just playing solitaire and Minesweeper for a while because, the appeal kind of wore off. And I think we're a little bit right there in the drone space. Like everyone has access to this technology and they're thinking, wow, this is really cool. I got a drone, it can fly. But then, okay, now what? And that now what is the critical phase because, let's look at the computers. In time, computers continued to get into the home. People continued to adopt the technology. We started to see just little bits of things open up, like the internet and the ability to do online banking. And our minds were blown. Like, what do you mean I don't have to go to the bank to check my balances or balance the checkbook or whatever it may be? And you start to see these like little use cases come up with the use of your personal computers and the internet. And I think about drones the same way. Industry and public service, automation and drones is probably like, hey, we're seeing little things here and there that are like really valuable, but it's that foundation that's going to allow us to get to transformational, where we're going to be at a point where we will wonder how we were able to do certain things without drones, enter certain domains that today might be completely inaccessible because this technology just isn't quite mature enough yet. And so the message I would leave is like, I'm very optimistic about what this can do, that this really can be truly transformational and have a net positive impact on the culture and the quality of life for folks, because you start to think of an aging population and aging demographic, and especially in North Dakota where you have rural communities, it's this kind of technology that might allow somebody to stay in their home longer than they otherwise would be able to with today's technology. So I'm really excited to see that future and more importantly, excited to help make that happen.
That's it for episode 368 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Trevor Woods of the Northern Plains UAS test site. I want to thank Trevor for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about the Northern Plains UAS test site or want to connect with Trevor, check out the webpage at npuasts.com. That's short for Northern Plains UAS Test Site. If you're looking for information on Vantis, go to vantisuas.com. If you like the Drone Radio Show, then I'm sure you're going to like being part of the community of Drone Radio Show advocates. I look forward to seeing you at patreon.com/Drone Radio Show. Check out the Patreon site for exclusive content now. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast. to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.